my dear snoozers. Tonight, we explore the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient device pulled from the bottom of the sea, so complex it simply should not exist. A machine built over 2,000 years ago that could calculate the movements of the stars, centuries before anyone was supposed to know how. Sometimes I question whether I should keep going, but every time I read your kind words, I remember exactly why I started. I'm still working toward 1,000 subscribers. It's a small number, but it means everything to me. If you enjoy what I create and want to support someone who puts her heart into every video, subscribing would truly make my day. All right, now let's get cozy. Find a comfortable position, close your eyes, breathe in slow, and let's begin. Picture yourself reaching into your pocket and pulling out your phone. You tap the screen, and instantly it tells you the time, the date, the phase of the moon, maybe even when the next solar eclipse will occur. We take this for granted. We barely even blink. But here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. What if someone did all of that, not with microchips and satellites, but with bronze gears and human hands over 2,000 years ago? That is not science fiction. That is the Antikythera mechanism. Think of your smartphone as the latest chapter in a very, very long story. A story that began not in Silicon Valley, but in ancient Greece. The Antikythera mechanism was, in every meaningful sense, a computing device. It tracked celestial cycles, it predicted astronomical events, it organized time itself into something a person could hold, turn and read, just like the device in your pocket does today. Now, we tend to think of ancient people as simple, as primitive. We imagine them gazing up at the stars with wonder, but without understanding. Yet here was a civilization that looked at the cosmos, studied its rhythms with extraordinary patience, and then built a machine to mirror those rhythms in metal and motion. Your phone did not appear from nowhere. It is the descendant of every clock, every calculator, every instrument ever made by human hands reaching toward understanding. And somewhere near the very beginning of that long lineage stands this strange, beautiful, impossible-seeming device pulled from the bottom of the sea. The next time you check your phone for the date, pause for just one breath. Somewhere in that simple gesture lives the echo of an ancient mind that wanted, more than anything, to make sense of the sky. Suppose you found yourself standing in a modern engineering workshop surrounded by precision tools, digital lathes, and computer-aided design software. Now suppose someone handed you a set of bronze gears and told you they were made by hand, without electricity, without microscopes, without any of the technology surrounding you. And then suppose they told you those gears were accurate enough to model the motion of the moon. You would probably say that is impossible. And yet, here we are. The Antikythera mechanism contains at least 30 distinct gears. Some of those gears have teeth so finely cut, so precisely spaced, that modern engineers who have studied replicas describe the tolerances as remarkable, even by contemporary standards. The gear teeth are small, consistent, and deliberately arranged to produce specific mathematical ratios. These were not decorative pieces. They were functional. They were intentional. They were, in every sense of the word, engineered. Here is what makes this even more astonishing. One particular gear system inside the mechanism modelled something called the lunar anomaly, the fact that the moon does not move through the sky at a perfectly even speed. It speeds up, it slows down, following an elliptical path that ancient astronomers had carefully observed over centuries. To capture the irregularity mechanically required a pin and slot gear arrangement so clever that it was not rediscovered by modern engineers until the 20th century. Think about that. A solution so elegant it took us nearly 2 millennia to reinvent it. These gears were not accidents of nature. They were the product of a mind or minds that understood mathematics, astronomy, and mechanical engineering at a level we are still trying to fully appreciate. Impossible gears, built by people we once called primitive. Perhaps it is our assumptions that need adjusting, not our admiration of the past. What if you spent your entire life building something extraordinary, and then history simply forgot your name? That is perhaps the most quietly heartbreaking thing about the Antikythera mechanism. We do not know who made it. We may never know. Somewhere in the ancient Greek world, possibly on the island of Rhodes, possibly in the workshops of a school of astronomical thought we can only partially reconstruct today, a mind of breathtaking capability sat down and designed a machine that should not have been possible for its time, and that person, or those people, left no signature we can read. Imagine being a craftsman of such extraordinary skill that your work survived 2,000 years underwater, was recovered in fragments, studied by the greatest scientific institutions in the world, and continues to generate awe and academic papers to this day. And yet your name is unknown. Your face is unrecorded. Your story is a blank page. History has a habit of preserving monuments and forgetting makers. We remember the pyramids, but struggle to name the architects. We admire the aqueducts, but rarely speak of the engineers. The Antikythera mechanism is perhaps the most dramatic example of this quiet injustice. Some researchers believe the mechanism may be connected to the tradition of Archimedes, the legendary mathematician and inventor of Syracuse. Others point to the astronomer Hipparchus, whose precise observations of the moon align remarkably well with what the device models. But these are educated guesses, beautiful hypotheses, not confirmed names. What we know for certain is this: someone possessed genius, profound, practical, world-altering genius, and they poured it into bronze and motion and mathematical ratios. They are forgotten, but their thinking is not. And perhaps that is a form of immortality that even history cannot fully erase. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, dark, cold, silent. A graveyard of ships and centuries, where time moves differently and the world above has no meaning. Now imagine that somewhere in that stillness, resting in the silt between scattered amphorae and marble statues, lies a wooden box. Inside the box, corroded almost beyond recognition, are the remains of a machine that will one day rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient technology. That box sat there for roughly 2,000 years. In the year 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers were sheltering near the small island of Antikythera, blown off course by a storm. When the weather cleared, they dove. What they found was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in all of human history, though no one fully understood that yet. The wreck contained bronze statues, glassware, coins and pottery. Treasures by any measure. But among the recovered objects was a corroded, encrusted lump of bronze that looked, to most eyes, like nothing at all. It was set aside. It was nearly overlooked. It was only later, as the fragments dried and cracked open, that something extraordinary became visible. Gear wheels. Tiny, precise, unmistakably intentional gear wheels embedded in what appeared to be a mechanical device of some kind. The world did not immediately understand what it was looking at. It would take decades of study and eventually the arrival of modern imaging technology before the full magnitude of the discovery became clear. A storm drove sponge divers to shelter. They dove for sponges. They found the ancient world's most sophisticated machine. If that is not a reminder that the universe hides its greatest secrets in the most unexpected places, then nothing is. Think about what a computer actually does at its most fundamental level. It takes in information. It processes that information through a set of rules. And it produces an output, an answer, a prediction, a model of something real. Now set aside the electricity. Set aside the screen. Set aside every piece of modern technology you associate with that word. What remains? A system that turns input into meaningful output through structured logic. By that definition, the Antikythera mechanism was a computer. A genuine, functional, analog computer built from bronze in the ancient world. You turned a hand crank, which represented a date, and the mechanism's gears process that input through mathematical relationships encoded in their ratios and arrangements. On the front, a display showed you where the sun and moon would appear in the zodiac. On the back, dials tracked longer cycles, the Metonic cycle of 19 years, the Saros cycle used to predict eclipses, and a 4-year cycle likely tied to the Greek athletic games. This was not a clock. It was not a calendar in the simple sense. It was a model of the cosmos that you could operate with your hands. To fully appreciate what this means, consider that the next mechanical device of comparable complexity would not appear in the historical record until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe more than 1,000 years later. There is a gap in the record that researchers find deeply unsettling. Not because they doubt the mechanism exists, it is sitting in a museum in Athens right now, but because they cannot explain the silence between it and everything that came after. Computing did not begin in the 20th century. It began with human minds determined to model the world around them. The machine just happened to be made of bronze. Place yourself on a hillside in the ancient world. The sky above you is clear and blue. People around you are going about their day, trading, talking, living. And then, slowly, impossibly, the sun begins to disappear. The light turns strange and golden. Animals go quiet. The air cools. A murmur moves through the crowd, then panic, then something approaching terror, because in a world without explanation, a solar eclipse is not an astronomical event. It is a message from the gods. It is the end of something. Now imagine you are the person who knew it was coming. One of the most extraordinary functions of the Antikythera mechanism was its ability to predict eclipses. On the back of the device, a dial tracked what is called the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 223 lunar months, or roughly 18 years and 11 days, after which eclipses tend to repeat in a predictable pattern. By tracking where you were within that cycle, the mechanism could indicate when an eclipse was likely to occur. This is not mysticism. This is applied mathematics operating through carefully cut gears and observed astronomical data accumulated over generations. Think about what that knowledge meant in practical terms. A priest, an advisor, an astronomer who could say with confidence that the sun would darken on a particular day held a form of power that was almost supernatural by the standards of the time. The Babylonians had tracked eclipse cycles on clay tablets for centuries before the Greeks, but the Antikythera mechanism turned that knowledge into something operable, something you could hold and turn and read. It transformed prediction from an act of memory into an act of mechanism. That is a profound leap, and it happened 2,000 years before we thought it could. Imagine meeting someone so far ahead of their time that the people around them could barely comprehend what they were doing. Not because the people were unintelligent, but because the ideas being expressed existed at a level that the surrounding world simply had not reached yet, a lone peak rising above the landscape. That is how many historians think about Archimedes. Archimedes of Syracuse lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era. He calculated an approximation of pi with astonishing accuracy. He laid the groundwork for calculus almost 2,000 years before Newton and Leibniz formalized it. He designed war machines so effective that Roman soldiers reportedly became afraid to approach the walls of Syracuse when they saw an unfamiliar rope or beam, fearing it was another of his inventions. Ancient sources describe him building a mechanical model of the solar system, a device that moved the sun, moon, and planets in accurate proportion. Sound familiar? We cannot say with certainty that Archimedes built the Antikythera mechanism. The timeline does not perfectly align, but his influence over the Greek mechanical and mathematical tradition was so profound that it is almost impossible to imagine a device of this sophistication existing without his shadow falling somewhere over its creation. Cicero, the Roman writer and statesman, wrote of seeing a device made by Archimedes, or one like it, that displayed the motions of the celestial bodies. He described it as something miraculous. What is remarkable is not just the genius of one man. It is the tradition he represented, a Greek intellectual world that believed the cosmos operated according to rational, mathematical principles, and that those principles could be modelled, measured, and held in human hands. The Antikythera mechanism may or may not be Archimedes' work, but it is absolutely his idea. Consider what it would be like to hold a mystery in your hands, something ancient and corroded and broken, knowing that the answer to one of history's greatest puzzles might be sealed inside, completely invisible, buried under 2,000 years of sea and time. You cannot cut it open. You cannot dissolve the corrosion without destroying what lies beneath. You can only look at the surface and wonder. That was the situation researchers faced with the Antikythera mechanism for most of the 20th century. Then came the imaging technology. In 2006, a team of researchers from the Antikythera mechanism research project used a technique called polynomial texture mapping combined with three-dimensional X-ray tomography to peer inside the fragments. What they found transformed the study of the mechanism almost overnight. Hidden beneath the surface of the corroded bronze, invisible to the naked eye, were inscriptions. Thousands of characters of ancient Greek text describing the functions of the mechanism, labelling its dials, and explaining its operation in what amounted to a user's manual encoded in metal. Imagine the moment that text began to emerge from the imaging data, symbols that had not been read for 2,000 years, surfacing again like something rising from deep water. The inscriptions confirmed what some researchers had suspected and others had doubted. This was not a piece of art. It was not a ceremonial object. It was a functional scientific instrument, built to be used, built to be understood, built with the assumption that the person operating it could read its instructions and follow them. Sometimes the most extraordinary things are not lost. They are merely hidden, waiting for us to develop the eyes to see them properly. The Antikythera mechanism waited patiently for 2,000 years, and when we finally looked closely enough, it spoke. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something you loved, but from losing something you never knew existed. Imagine discovering that a library burned down before you were born, and inside that library were books that answered questions the world is still asking. You cannot mourn what you never knew. But once you know it existed, the absence becomes real and heavy. That is something of how historians feel about the technology represented by the Antikythera mechanism. Here is the uncomfortable truth. We do not know if this device was unique or simply the only survivor. We have no other examples of comparable mechanical complexity from the ancient world. The gap between the Antikythera mechanism and the next known geared astronomical instruments appearing in the Islamic world in the early medieval period and in European clockmaking by the 13th and 14th centuries spans more than 1,000 years. Did other devices like it exist and simply not survive? Bronze is valuable. In times of war or economic hardship, metal objects get melted down and repurposed. Wooden components rot. The sea corrodes. Time consumes almost everything. The survival of the Antikythera mechanism was, by any reasonable measure, an accident. What we may be looking at is not the peak of ancient technology, but a single, fortunate fragment of a much richer tradition of mechanical knowledge that was simply lost. Not suppressed. Not forbidden. Just gone, the way so many things go, quietly and without ceremony, in the noise and upheaval of centuries. This is the thought that lingers long after the mechanical details have been set aside. Not what the mechanism could do, but what it tells us about how much we have lost, and how much we will never know we lost. Run your fingers along the cover of a book you love. Feel the texture of it, the weight of it. Now imagine that this book, this particular book, had been sitting closed at the bottom of the ocean for 2,000 years. And imagine that when it was finally retrieved and the pages were carefully, painstakingly separated, The words inside told you something that changed your understanding of an entire civilization. That is not far from what happened with the inscriptions found within the Antikythera mechanism. Researchers had known for decades that there were inscriptions on the mechanism's exterior. Some were partially legible. They referred to astronomical phenomena, to planetary cycles, to the months of the Egyptian calendar. But the deeper inscriptions, the ones sealed inside the corroded layers of bronze, were inaccessible until modern imaging technology made it possible to read them without physically disturbing the fragments. What emerged was a text of profound importance. The inscriptions describe what the front display shows, the positions of the sun and moon, and likely the 5 planets visible to the naked eye. They explain the back dials. They use language that is clear and instructional, the language of a device meant to be operated and understood, not merely admired. One passage has become particularly significant to researchers. It describes the colour of an eclipse, suggesting that the mechanism may have been used to predict not just when an eclipse would occur, but something about its character and appearance. These hidden words are a bridge. They connect us directly to a mind that lived and thought and built 2,000 years ago. They are not myth. They are not legend. They are instructions, written in the careful hand of someone who wanted their machine to be understood. And after 2 millennia of silence, it is. Think of knowledge the way you might think of a river. It flows, it branches, it feeds into other rivers, it carves the landscape of what comes after. But sometimes a river goes underground. It does not disappear. It simply moves beneath the surface, invisible, until it finds a place to emerge again. The knowledge embedded in the Antikythera mechanism went underground for a very long time. Ancient Greek astronomical and mechanical knowledge did not vanish overnight. It was carried forward in fragments through Roman scholars who read Greek texts, through Arab astronomers who translated and expanded upon those texts during the Islamic Golden Age, through the slow, careful recovery of classical learning in medieval European universities. The river moved, it changed course, it fed into new traditions, but something was lost in translation. Not the mathematics necessarily, not all of the astronomy, but the particular ambition of taking that knowledge and encoding it into a working mechanical device, that specific leap, that confidence in the power of mechanism to model the cosmos, that seems to have been set aside for centuries. Why? We can speculate. The fall of Rome disrupted trade networks and intellectual institutions. The destruction of great libraries erased texts that were never recopied. Wars, plagues, and economic collapse redirected human energy away from pure inquiry towards simple survival. Knowledge is fragile in ways that stone is not. And yet here is the quietly hopeful thought. The knowledge did not die. It was buried, not burned. The Antikythera mechanism survived. The mathematical principles it embodies were rediscovered. The tradition it represents was eventually continued. Buried knowledge tends to resurface. It just sometimes takes 2,000 years and a sponge diver's accidental discovery to bring it back into the light. There is something almost meditative about sitting with a question you know may never be answered. Not the frustration of an unsolved problem you expect to crack eventually, but the deeper, quieter experience of a mystery that may simply be beyond reach, permanently, by nature of what time does to evidence. The Antikythera mechanism is surrounded by those kinds of questions. Who built it? We do not know. Where exactly was it made? Uncertain, though linguistic analysis of the inscriptions and the astronomical data encoded in the mechanism points toward the Greek world of the 1st or 2nd century before the Common Era, with some researchers favouring Rhodes. Was it one of a kind? Possibly not, but we have no other examples. Who owned it? Was it a teaching device, a tool for a practicing astronomer, a gift for a powerful patron? The wreck itself offers clues but no definitive answers. And then there are the deeper questions. Questions that keep researchers awake at night, If this level of mechanical sophistication existed in the ancient world, what else existed that we simply have not found? How far did this tradition extend? Were there craftspeople in workshops across the Mediterranean building similar instruments that simply did not survive? And if so, what does that mean for our understanding of the ancient world? We often tell the story of human progress as a straight line moving upward. The Antikythera mechanism suggests that line is actually far more complicated. That there were peaks we lost track of, valleys where knowledge retreated, and perhaps summits we are still climbing toward that someone else reached long before us. Living with unanswered questions is not defeat, it is honesty. And sometimes it is the most intellectually courageous thing we can do. Imagine you are reading the minutes of a very long meeting. Decades of entries, page after page, recording every discovery, every debate, every advancement in human knowledge. And then, on one particular page, in the middle of what should be a continuing conversation, there is simply nothing. A blank, not an explanation of why the meeting stopped, just silence, stretching across centuries before the entries begin again. That is roughly what historians encounter when they study the Antikythera mechanism in the context of the broader history of science and technology. Here was a device of extraordinary mechanical sophistication existing in the 1st or 2nd century before the Common Era, and then, in the historical record, there is essentially nothing comparable for over 1,000 years. No surviving devices, no descriptions of devices like it. A kind of silence in the archive of human achievement that is deeply difficult to explain. This is sometimes called the problem of the missing tradition. Not the missing mechanism, we have that, but the missing chain of development that should logically connect it to what came before and what came after. We would expect to find simpler precursor devices, early experiments, more primitive versions of the same technology. We would expect to find successors, improved models, wider use. Instead, we find one extraordinary object, and then quiet. Some scholars argue that the tradition existed, but the physical object simply did not survive. Others suggest that the knowledge was always rare, held by a small number of specialists whose works were never widely reproduced. Neither explanation is entirely satisfying. The scientific silence around the Antikythera mechanism is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence of how much we do not know and how much the passage of time can erase from even the most remarkable chapters of human ingenuity. We use the phrase Dark Ages carefully now. Historians are rightly cautious about it because it implies a uniformity of decline that the evidence does not support. The centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire were not simply dark. They were complicated, regionally varied, full of preservation and loss happening simultaneously in different places. But there is a gap, and the Antikythera mechanism sits at one edge of it. On one side of that gap, we have a civilization capable of building a geared analog computer that modelled the cosmos. On the other side, after centuries of political upheaval, plague, and the slow dissolution of the institutional structures that had supported advanced inquiry, we find a world that is, in many respects, rebuilding its understanding of things the ancient Greeks had already mastered. This is not about intelligence. The people living through late antiquity and the early medieval period were every bit as capable as their predecessors. But capability requires context. It requires libraries and teachers and patrons and trade networks and enough political stability for people to devote time to things that do not immediately feed or defend them. When those conditions collapse, knowledge does not automatically survive. Think of it like a garden. The plants represent knowledge. The soil represents the institutions and networks that support learning. When the soil is disrupted, even healthy plants do not survive, and when the garden is eventually replanted, it does not begin where it left off. It begins again from seeds, many of which have changed in transit. The Dark Ages gap around the Antikythera mechanism is a reminder that progress is not guaranteed, that it depends on conditions, that the accumulation of knowledge is always fragile, and that what we have built today deserves to be tended as carefully as anything we have ever inherited. Picture yourself underwater, not far, maybe 30 or 40 meters, but far enough that the world above is a distant shimmer of light, and the pressure around you is something you feel in your chest and in your ears. You are holding your breath. You have been doing this your whole life, as your father did, and his father before him. You are looking for sponges on the seafloor, the way your community has always made its living. And then you see something that does not belong. The sponge divers of the island of Symi were some of the most experienced free divers in the Greek world in the year 1900. They had spent seasons working the North African coastline and were returning home when a storm pushed them toward Antikythera. While sheltering there, one of them dove and encountered a shipwreck at a depth of approximately 45 meters, extraordinary for a breath-hold dive filled with ancient artifacts. The recovery operation that followed was conducted by the Greek Navy and lasted months. It was dangerous, physically brutal work. Several divers suffered decompression sickness. One died. Their efforts brought up bronze and marble statues, pottery, jewellery and coins that together represented one of the richest ancient shipwrecks ever discovered. And among all of that treasure, the corroded bronze lump that would become the most important object in the history of science. The sponge divers did not know what they had found. How could they? But without their particular skill, their particular tradition, their willingness to go deeper than was strictly safe, that lump might still be lying on the seafloor. The greatest machine of the ancient world was recovered not by scientists or archaeologists, but by working men doing their job in difficult conditions. That is worth remembering. Hold a coin in your hand. Feel the weight of it, the coolness of the metal against your palm. Bronze is one of humanity's oldest working materials. An alloy of copper and tin that ancient civilizations discovered could be cast, hammered and shaped into almost anything they needed. Weapons, vessels, statues, mirrors, bells, and, it turns out, the most sophisticated mechanical device the ancient world ever produced. The choice of bronze for the Antikythera mechanism was not arbitrary. Bronze was the metal of precision in the ancient world. It could be cast in rough form and then worked with tools to achieve fine tolerances. It held its shape. It did not corrode as rapidly as iron. It was available throughout the Mediterranean through well-established trade networks. But working bronze to the level of precision required by the mechanism's gears was a different kind of craft entirely. The gear teeth on the mechanism had to be cut with consistent spacing and correct angles for the gear ratios to function accurately. This required not just metalworking skill but mathematical knowledge, the ability to divide a circle into a specific number of equal parts and then cut each division cleanly and correctly. Researchers who have attempted to recreate the mechanism using only tools and techniques plausibly available in the ancient world describe the process as demanding, painstaking, and genuinely impressive even by modern standards. The craftspeople who built this were not generalists. They were specialists of the highest order. Bronze keeps secrets well, sealed under the sea, protected by the very corrosion that made it so difficult to study. The mechanism's internal structure survived for 2 millennia. The metal that ancient hands shaped with such care held its form long enough for our imaging technology to read what those hands had encoded. Bronze speaks slowly, but when it finally speaks, it says something extraordinary. There is a Greek myth about a bronze giant named Talos, a mechanical guardian of the island of Crete, built by the god Hephaestus to walk the shoreline 3 times a day and protect the island from invaders. He was not flesh. He was not magic, exactly. He was built. Constructed. A machine given purpose and motion by divine craftsmanship. Why does a civilization invent that kind of myth? Usually the stories a culture tells reflect the questions it is already asking. Myths about mechanical beings, about animated statues, about devices that think or move or predict, are not random. They emerge from a world already thinking about the relationship between craft and intelligence, between mechanism and meaning. The ancient Greeks told many such stories. Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, was said to have built golden maidens who could speak and assist him in his forge. Daedalus, the legendary craftsman, was credited with creating moving statues so lifelike they had to be chained to keep them from walking away. These are not literal accounts, but they are records of imagination, of aspiration, of a culture that found the idea of a thinking, moving, built thing both plausible and fascinating. The Antikythera mechanism lived in that same world. It did not walk or speak, but it did something arguably more impressive, it thought. Or at least, it encoded a form of reasoning in its gears, allowing a user to ask a question about time and the sky and receive a reliable, mathematically grounded answer. Perhaps the myths of mechanical giants and golden maidens were not fantasy at all. Perhaps they were the cultural expression of something the ancient Greek world was actually, quietly, seriously attempting to do, to build a mind out of metal. Lie back and look up at the night sky. On a clear night, away from city lights, the stars appear fixed, steady, eternal, arranged in their constellations as they have been for all of human history. But if you watch carefully, night after night, week after week, you will notice that some of those lights move, not quickly, not dramatically, but they drift against the background of the fixed stars in ways that the stars themselves do not. The ancients called these wandering lights planets, the Greek word for wanderers. We call them planets. Tracking the motion of the planets was one of the great preoccupations of ancient astronomy, not simply because it was intellectually interesting, though it was, but because it was practically important. In a world where the movements of celestial bodies were understood to correspond to events on Earth, knowing where the planets were and where they were going had implications for agriculture, for navigation, for medicine, for statecraft. The Antikythera mechanism almost certainly tracked the planets. The evidence for this has grown significantly with the most recent detailed analyses of the mechanism's fragments. Researchers from University College London published work in 2021 suggesting a reconstruction of the front face of the mechanism that included pointers for the 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. If correct, this means the mechanism modelled not just the Sun and Moon, but the entire visible solar system, each body represented by a pointer moving at its own rate, driven by its own gear train, encoding in bronze the hard-won observational knowledge of generations of astronomers. Someone looked up at those wandering lights. They measured them. They calculated. And then they built a machine that could wander with them. Try something for a moment. Walk across a room at a perfectly even pace, 1 step per second, steady and consistent. Now try to imagine walking across the same room but speeding up gradually in the middle and slowing down again at the end, while the person watching you is trying to predict exactly where you will be at any given moment. That second walk is something like the moon's actual behaviour. The moon does not move through its orbit at a constant speed. It speeds up when it is closer to Earth and slows down when it is farther away, a consequence of the elliptical shape of its orbit and the gravitational dynamics involved. To an ancient observer carefully tracking the moon's position night after night, this irregularity was noticeable and frustrating. A simple model of the moon moving at a steady pace would produce errors, small but accumulating, that would make predictions increasingly inaccurate over time. The Antikythera mechanism solved this problem through a device so elegant it reads almost like poetry in mechanical form. 2 gears, one mounted on the other, connected by a pin fitting into a slot. As the pin moved around its circular path, the slot it was running in caused the output gear to speed up and slow down in a way that closely mirrored the moon's actual varying velocity. This is called the pin and slot mechanism. It is, in engineering terms, a thing of beauty. It takes an irregular, real-world phenomenon and approximates it through a clever mechanical arrangement that was not rediscovered in the modern era until researchers were trying to understand what was inside the Antikythera mechanism itself. The moon had its own strange rhythm, and someone, 2,000 years ago, listened carefully enough to encode that rhythm in bronze. Consider what it takes to be truly precise, not approximately right, not close enough. Precise. A watchmaker leans over a table under a bright light, holding a loupe to their eye, fitting a component so small it nearly disappears between their fingers. The margin for error is measured not in millimeters, but in fractions of millimeters. A deviation too small to see with the naked eye can cause an entire watch to run incorrectly. Now imagine achieving that kind of precision without a loupe, without modern measuring tools, without the accumulated tradition of precision engineering that stretches from the European clockmakers of the medieval period to the Swiss watch industry to the microchip fabrication plants of today. The creators of the Antikythera mechanism were working without that tradition, or rather, they were at the beginning of it, and yet the measurements encoded in the mechanism's gears are, in several cases, accurate to a degree that astonishes modern engineers. The metonic cycle, the period of approximately 19 years after which the phases of the moon repeat on the same days of the solar year, is encoded in the mechanism with a gear ratio of 254 teeth to 19. The actual astronomical ratio required to model this cycle accurately is 254 to 19. The match is exact. The Saros eclipse prediction cycle is similarly precise. The gear trains modelling the motion of the sun and moon produce outputs that align with our modern understanding of those motions to a degree that implies either extraordinary luck or extraordinary care. It was not luck. It was observation. Centuries of careful, patient, cumulative observation, recorded and refined and eventually encoded in the teeth of bronze gears by hands steady enough and minds precise enough to do it justice. Ancient precision. It is not an oxymoron. It is a fact. Envision yourself lying flat on your back in an open field, far from any city, on a night so clear the sky feels close enough to touch. The stars above you are not decoration. They are information. They are a clock, a calendar, a map, and a story all at once. For most of human history, this was the only screen anyone had, and people read it with extraordinary care. But starlight is patient in a way that human memory is not. The patterns repeat, but not on a schedule easy to hold in one mind across one lifetime. The moon rises and sets, the planets drift, eclipses come and go, and the knowledge of when and why these things happen has always been hard-won, accumulated slowly over generations, vulnerable to the simple fact that people die and not everything they know gets written down. This is what makes the Antikythera mechanism so quietly devastating to think about. Someone, or a community of someones, had gathered an extraordinary amount of that starlight knowledge. Not just observations, but the mathematical relationships between those observations, the ratios, the cycles, the long, patient arithmetic of celestial prediction. And they did not simply record it in words. They encoded it in motion. They stole the rhythm of the sky and locked it inside bronze gears. Starlight that had taken centuries of human watching to decode was compressed into a device small enough to carry on a ship. Every turn of the hand crank was a question put to the cosmos. Every movement of the pointers was an answer given back. That knowledge sank with the ship. It waited in the dark for 2,000 years. And when it was finally raised and studied, it felt less like a recovery and more like a theft returned. The stars had kept their secret long enough. It was time for the mechanism to speak again. Let yourself drift into a quiet workshop in your mind. Tools hang on the walls. Thin shavings of bronze curl on the floor. A craftsperson bends close to a small dial, carefully scratching marks into a circular surface, each mark placed with deliberate precision. But this dial is not a simple circle. It spirals. It coils outward from its centre like the inside of a nautilus shell, and each revolution of the spiral represents not just a full circle of counting, but a continuation, a next layer, a deeper turn into time. The back face of the Antikythera mechanism features two large spiral dials, and they represent one of the most elegant design solutions in the entire device. The problem was a simple one on the surface, but complex underneath. Certain astronomical cycles involve large numbers of months. The Metonic cycle spans 235 months. The Saros eclipse cycle involves 223 months. If you tried to display those counts on a simple circular dial, you would need either an enormous dial or markings too small to read clearly. Neither was practical. The solution was the spiral. By coiling the scale inward, the craftspeople of the mechanism were able to display a long sequence of months on a compact surface, with a pointer that followed the groove of the spiral outward over time, advancing one division per month. When it reached the end of the outer coil, a small follower mechanism allowed it to return and begin again from the centre. It is the same elegant thinking behind a vinyl record, a coiled spring, or the growth pattern of a shell. Nature already knew the answer. The mechanism's makers simply applied it to the problem of making time readable. Spiral thinking, 2,000 years old and still beautiful. Step for a moment into the mindset of an ancient Greek philosopher sitting in the shade of a colonnade, papyrus in hand, watching the light shift across a sundial's face. To this person, mathematics was not merely a tool. It was a language, and the universe was the text written in it. The cosmos was not chaotic or random. It was ordered. It was rational. It was, in the deepest sense, mathematical, and if you were patient enough and clever enough, you could read it. This belief was not simply religious feeling dressed in philosophical language. It was a working hypothesis that produced real results. The Greek astronomical tradition, building on earlier Babylonian observations, had identified precise numerical relationships between celestial cycles. The sun, the moon, the planets all moved according to ratios that could be expressed as fractions, as gear teeth, as the carefully counted divisions on a spiral dial. The Antikythera mechanism is the physical embodiment of that belief. It is not just a machine. It is a philosophical statement made in bronze. It says, the cosmos follows rules. Those rules can be expressed mathematically, and mathematics can be built, literally constructed, into a device that models reality. Every gear ratio in the mechanism corresponds to an observed astronomical relationship. Every dial division maps to a counted cycle. The mathematics is not applied to the mechanism from the outside. It is the mechanism. The bronze is just the form the mathematics chose to take. This is the idea that eventually led, through centuries of refinement, to the scientific revolution, to Newton's laws, to Einstein's equations, to the physics that put satellites into orbit and probes beyond the edges of the solar system. It began, in some meaningful sense, with the conviction that the sky was mathematics you could touch. And someone proved it. Picture yourself as a careful keeper of records in the ancient world, not a philosopher sitting in sunny contemplation, but someone practical, working with clay tablets or papyrus rolls, recording the date and appearance of every eclipse observed over decades, then passing those records to the next generation, who add their observations and pass them on again. Century after century of patient notation, building slowly toward a pattern so large no single human lifetime is long enough to see it. That pattern is the Saros cycle. Babylonian astronomers were among the first to identify it, though they may not have understood its cause. What they observed was this: if you wait approximately 18 years, 11 days and 8 hours, eclipses begin to repeat. Not perfectly, not in the exact same location, but in the same sequence and with the same character. The geometry of the Earth, Moon and Sun returns to a configuration close enough to the previous one that the same kind of eclipse occurs again. The Saros cycle spans 223 lunar months. It is not a round number. It does not fit neatly into any single human-scale unit of time. It is the period it takes for 3 separate astronomical cycles, the synodic month, the anomalistic month, and the draconic month, to realign closely enough to reproduce eclipse conditions. To track this cycle mechanically required a gear with 223 divisions. That gear exists inside the Antikythera mechanism. Here is the thought that never quite lets go. The Saros cycle was discovered through centuries of human observation, carefully recorded and transmitted across generations. The mechanism compressed all of that inherited knowledge into a single bronze gear that a single person could hold. Generations of watching. One gear. The patience of civilization made portable. What if you were placed in a room where a single dial on the wall could tell you not just the present moment, but any moment you chose, past or future? You turn it forward, and the mechanism shows you where the moon will be in 3 years. You turn it backward, and it shows you where the sun stood on the day of a famous eclipse 3 generations before you were born. The room does not move. The world outside does not change. But through the logic of the machine, time becomes something you can navigate. This is not a fantasy. This is an approximate description of what the Antikythera mechanism could do. Because the device modelled the mathematical relationships between celestial cycles rather than the cycles themselves in real time, it was not bound to the present moment the way a simple clock is. Turn the hand crank forward, and the gears advance the pointers proportionally. Turn it backward, and the pointers retreat. The mechanism did not care which direction time was moving. It only cared about the relationships between its moving parts. This gave its user an extraordinary power. The ability to ask questions about the sky, not just tonight, but on any date within the range of the mechanism's cycles. An astronomer wanting to check the moon's position on a date years in the future could simply advance the crank to the appropriate point on the calendar scale and read the answer directly from the display. And looking backward was equally possible. Historical eclipses, recorded in astronomical chronicles, could be checked against the mechanism to verify dating, or to anchor other events in time. We tend to think of time as something that only moves forward. The Antikythera mechanism disagreed. For the mind that understood it, time was a dial, and the dial turned both ways. Bring to mind a snow globe sitting on a shelf. Inside it, a tiny world, a small city, bare trees, perhaps a figure or two standing motionless in the permanent artificial winter. You pick it up, shake it, and snow swirls around that miniature world. It is a model. It is not the real city. It does not contain real snow or real people. But it captures something essential about the feeling of that world, and holding it in your hands gives you a particular kind of relationship to the thing it represents. The Antikythera mechanism was something like this, except instead of a city it contained the solar system, and instead of being decorative it was a working scientific instrument. Imagine a device roughly the size of a large book, perhaps 33 centimeters tall and 17 centimeters wide. On its front face, pointers move across a circular display showing the zodiac and the Egyptian calendar. One pointer traces the sun's annual path. Another models the moon, showing not just its position but its phase, through a small rotating ball, half dark and half light. Additional pointers, according to recent reconstructions, represented each of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye. Inside that compact case, at least 30 gears, probably more, turned against each other in a carefully choreographed mechanical dance, each representing a real relationship between real astronomical cycles. The known universe, everything the ancient Greek world understood about a moving sky, fit inside a wooden box you could carry on a ship. Think about what it means to hold the cosmos in your hands, not as poetry or metaphor, but as a mechanical fact. You turn a crank, the universe turns with you. The sun advances, the moon phases, the planets wander. A miniature universe, built by human hands, answering human questions. Walk with me for a moment through a city that no longer exists as it was. Streets lined with scholars from a dozen cultures, a harbour busy with ships carrying not just goods, but ideas, and at the heart of it all, a library unlike anything the world had seen before, or, arguably, since. The Library of Alexandria was not merely a collection of books. It was an institution of living knowledge, where the accumulated learning of the ancient Mediterranean world was gathered, copied, studied, and debated. It burns in our imagination as a symbol of irreversible loss. Though the truth of how it disappeared is more complicated and gradual than the dramatic single burning most people picture, the effect was real. Texts were lost. Traditions were broken. Conversations that had been ongoing for centuries simply stopped. The Antikythera mechanism carries the ghost of Alexandria in its gears. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the mechanism reflects the kind of work that was being done in Alexandrian intellectual circles. The mathematics of Hipparchus, the cosmological models of Greek astronomy, the observational data accumulated by multiple generations of careful skywatchers, all of this is present in the ratios and cycles the mechanism embodies. It is a physical artifact of a world of knowledge that was largely, though never entirely, lost. What else was in that tradition? What other mechanical devices, what other instruments, what other applications of astronomical mathematics to practical technology existed in that vanished world? We do not know. We have the mechanism. We have fragments of texts. We have echoes. Alexandria's ghost moves through the study of the Antikythera mechanism like background noise in a recording, always present, always reminding us that what we are looking at is not the whole picture. It is a window, and beyond the glass there is a world we can barely see. Go outside on a clear night and find a spot where you can see the sky without too much interference from artificial light. Pick a bright point of light and watch it. If it twinkles slightly and seems fixed in relation to the stars around it, it is a star. If it shines steadily and over days and weeks appears to drift against the background of fixed stars, it is a planet. The ancient Greeks noticed this too, and it fascinated them deeply. The word planet comes from the Greek word for wanderer, and the behaviour of these wandering lights posed one of the central intellectual challenges of ancient astronomy. Why do they move? What are the rules governing their motion? And can those rules be predicted far enough in advance to be useful? Answering those questions took centuries. The ancient world developed increasingly sophisticated geometric models to describe planetary motion, none of them physically correct by our modern understanding, but many of them mathematically effective for prediction within their limitations. Epicycles, deferents, equant points, a whole vocabulary of imaginary circles arranged to reproduce the apparent paths of the planets across the sky. The Antikythera mechanism encoded these models mechanically. Each planet required its own gear train, producing outputs corresponding to the planet's apparent position in the zodiac at any given date. According to the most recent reconstructions, the front face of the mechanism displayed all 5 classical planets alongside the Sun and Moon. Think about the ambition of that, to look up at 7 wandering lights and say, I understand your pattern. I can build your dance in bronze. I can hold your movements in my hand. The wandering stars were not random. They were rule-governed. And someone, 2,000 years ago, understood the rules well enough to miniaturize them. Picture the back wheels of a car making a turn. The outer wheel has to travel a longer arc than the inner wheel during the turn, and yet both wheels are driven by the same engine. How does the car handle this without something breaking? The answer is the differential, a clever gear arrangement that allows two outputs to run at different speeds while being driven by the same input. You have one of these in your car. It is an engineering solution so fundamental and effective that it appears in almost every vehicle on Earth. It also appears, in some form, in the Antikythera mechanism. And it was identified there before anyone fully understood how modern differentials came to be. One of the gear arrangements within the mechanism appears to function as a form of differential gearing, taking two separate astronomical cycles and combining them through a single mechanical output. Some researchers believe this was used to produce a display related to the moon's phase, combining the rates of the sun and moon pointer to show the angular difference between them, which determines whether the moon appears new, full, or somewhere between. To achieve this in the ancient world, without the benefit of the engineering tradition that produced the automobile differential 18 or 19 centuries later, is remarkable. It suggests either that the maker arrived at this solution independently through their own reasoning and experimentation, or that there was a tradition of mechanical knowledge, now largely lost, that had already worked through these problems. Both possibilities are extraordinary. A principle fundamental enough to end up in every modern car on Earth was quietly encoded inside an ancient Greek astronomical computer, turning inside a box no bigger than a large dictionary. Engineering does not always move in one direction. Sometimes it moves in circles. Think about the first time you looked at a clock face and actually understood it. Not just read it, but understood what you were looking at. That the hands moved at different rates because they were tracking different cycles. That the numbers were arranged in a circle because a circle was the natural shape for something that repeats. That the whole arrangement was a compression of time into a readable, navigable form. Someone had to design that. Someone had to decide that a circle was the right shape, that hands moving at different speeds were the right metaphor, that the numbers should be arranged in a particular way to make reading intuitive. The designers of the Antikythera mechanism made the same kinds of decisions, and decoding those decisions has been one of the great intellectual puzzles of modern science. The front face of the mechanism featured a large circular display with concentric rings. One ring showed the zodiac, divided into 12 sections corresponding to the 12 constellations through which the sun appears to move over the course of a year. Another ring displayed the Egyptian calendar of 365 days. Pointers moving across these rings showed the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. The back face carried two large spiral dials, each subdivided into smaller cells, each cell representing 1 month. Smaller subsidiary dials nested within the larger ones, tracking additional cycles related to eclipse prediction and, according to some researchers, the timing of the Pan-Hellenic Games. Each dial was a layer of meaning, each pointer a separate conversation between the mechanism and the cosmos. Reading those dials required knowledge, but the dials themselves were the knowledge, made physical, made accessible, made operable by anyone who had been taught what they meant. That is what good design does. It makes the complex readable. Stand at the edge of a garden in autumn and watch a single leaf fall. Now imagine watching that same tree through 19 full years, noting every spring where the blossoms appear, every autumn where the colour turns, every winter where the branches stand bare. By the end of those 19 years, you would have watched something extraordinary. The phases of the moon returning to fall on the same days of the solar year as when you started watching. This is the Metonic cycle, named for the Greek astronomer Meton of Athens, who described it in the 5th century before the Common Era, though Babylonian astronomers had observed it even earlier. The relationship is this: 19 solar years contain almost exactly 235 lunar months. The difference between the two is so small, only about 2 hours, that after 19 years, the moon's phases have almost perfectly resynchronized with the solar calendar. This means that if there is a full moon on a particular date this year, there will also be a full moon on approximately the same date 19 years from now. For a civilization that used both a lunar calendar and a solar one, this was an enormously practical discovery. It meant you could reconcile the two systems with a known correction applied every 19 years. The Antikythera mechanism tracked this cycle on one of its large spiral dials, the upper dial on the back face, divided into 235 cells arranged in a 5-turn spiral, each cell representing 1 month. A pointer advanced 1 cell per month, returning to the start after 19 years. 19 years of the moon's dance compressed into a spiral on a dial the size of your hand. The patience of ancient observation held still in bronze. There is a particular kind of wonder that comes not from answers, but from the very best questions. The questions that do not close when you answer them but open further, like a door revealing not a room but a corridor, and at the end of that corridor, another door. These are the questions that stay with you, that grow over time rather than diminishing, that reveal more about the nature of the inquiry than about any single fact. The Antikythera mechanism is, at its core, one of these kinds of questions. We know a great deal about it now. Modern imaging technology has revealed its inscriptions. Careful mechanical analysis has reconstructed much of its gear train. The astronomical cycles it tracked have been identified. The scholarly literature on the mechanism fills volumes, and yet it remains, in important ways, a mystery. We do not know who made it. We do not know who owned the ship it was travelling on, or where that ship was going. We do not know whether it was one of a kind or one of many. We do not know the full extent of the mechanical tradition that produced it. We do not know what happened to that tradition, why it apparently left no direct successors for more than 1,000 years. And perhaps most importantly, we do not know what it meant to the people who used it. Was it a tool of power, held by a priest or ruler as evidence of divine connection to the sky? Was it a teaching instrument, used to demonstrate astronomy to students? Was it a personal instrument, a philosopher's working companion? The machine speaks, but it speaks in fragments, and some of what it is trying to say may simply be beyond our reach. That is not a failure. That is the condition of history. And sometimes the mystery itself is the gift. Close your eyes and listen to a piece of music you love. Really listen. Beneath the melody you are conscious of, there is structure. Rhythms within rhythms. A bass line that repeats while a treble line develops. A chord progression that cycles while a solo improvises above it. Different musical voices moving at different rates, each following its own logic, and yet somehow, when combined, producing something unified and beautiful. This is what the ancient Greek philosophical tradition called cosmic harmony. The idea that the universe, like music, was built from the interaction of multiple cycles moving at different speeds, each governed by its own mathematical ratio, and together producing an order that was not just functional, but beautiful. The philosopher Pythagoras, and the tradition he inspired, believed that the same mathematical relationships that produce consonant musical intervals also governed the movements of the celestial bodies. Whether or not this specific belief was literally true, it was metaphorically profound, and the Antikythera mechanism is its mechanical expression. Look at how the device works. Multiple gear trains. Each gear train moving at a different rate. Each rate corresponding to a real astronomical cycle. The sun moving through the zodiac once per year. The moon cycling through its phases once per month. The longer planetary cycles, each with their own gear-driven rhythms, and all of these separate rhythms driven by a single hand crank, turning together, interacting, producing outputs that reflect the actual state of the cosmos. It is, in a very real sense, a machine that plays the music of the spheres. The ancient Greeks believed the cosmos was harmony made visible, The Antikythera mechanism was their attempt to make that harmony audible in the language of mechanics. And 2,000 years later, we are still listening. Think about the last time you picked up a jigsaw puzzle and found that some of the pieces were missing. Not just one or two, but a significant portion. Enough that the image you are assembling has gaps, significant ones, places where you can see the shape of what should be there but cannot confirm what it is. You build what you can. You fill in the rest with inference, with pattern recognition, with your best understanding of how the missing parts must relate to the parts you have. This is the situation facing every researcher who has ever studied the Antikythera mechanism. Of the original device, we have 82 fragments of varying size and completeness. Some are substantial, others are tiny, carrying only a few gear teeth or a partial inscription. And crucially, significant portions of the original mechanism are simply gone, dissolved in the sea over 2,000 years, or lost in the recovery process, or still resting on the seafloor, waiting to be found. This means that every reconstruction of the complete mechanism is to some degree an educated hypothesis. The researchers who build physical replicas are doing something closer to detective work than engineering. They are reasoning from the fragments they have, from the inscriptions that provide functional descriptions, from the known astronomical cycles of the period, and from the logic of mechanism itself, asking at every step, what gear arrangement would produce this output? What is the simplest explanation that fits all the known evidence? Different research teams have arrived at different answers for some parts of the mechanism. The front-face planetary display remains a subject of active scholarly debate. The puzzle is magnificent. The puzzle is incomplete. And the puzzle, precisely because it is incomplete, keeps producing new questions. Perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Imagine something falling asleep for 2,000 years, not dying, just sleeping, beyond reach, beyond use, beyond memory. And then one day, slowly, something wakes it. Not all at once. First a glimpse, then a question, then a theory, then a machine that peers inside it without touching it, then a reading of words that had not been read for 20 centuries. A slow, patient awakening carried out by people who would never have been able to predict what they were about to find. That is the story of the Antikythera mechanism's modern life. For decades after its recovery in 1901, it was studied but not understood. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, recognized as significant, photographed and described, but not fully decoded. The gear wheels were visible, but their purpose was uncertain. The inscriptions were partially legible, but their full text was sealed inside the corrosion. Then, piece by piece, the tools available to researchers improved. X-ray imaging revealed internal structure. Polynomial texture mapping enhanced surface inscriptions. Three-dimensional computed tomography allowed the internal gear trains to be mapped with extraordinary precision. Each new technology brought new revelations. Each revelation brought new questions. And alongside the scientific investigation, something else was reborn. A curiosity, a genuine public wonder about what this machine meant and what it said about the people who built it. The Antikythera mechanism became not just a scientific puzzle, but a cultural one, a mirror in which modern people looked and found an ancient reflection of their own impulse to understand the world, to build tools that extend the reach of the mind, to make the cosmos legible. That impulse did not begin with us. It is very, very old, and something in us recognizes it across 2,000 years, the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in a long time, and feel, unexpectedly, at home.